Now we'll look at the principal muscles of the neck. We'll build up our picture from the inside to the outside. We'll start with 4 short muscles on the underside of the occiput, the 2 oblique muscles and the 2 rectus muscles. Collectively, these are called the suboccipital muscles. Here are the 2 rectus capitis muscles, minor and major. Rectus capitis minor goes from the middle of the posterior arch of the atlas to this area on the occiput. Rectus capitis major goes from the spinous process of the atlas to here on the occiput. Here are the 2 oblique or obliquus capitis muscles, the inferior and the much smaller superior. The inferior oblique goes from the spine of the axis vertebra to the transverse process of the atlas. The superior oblique goes from the transverse process of the atlas to here on the occiput. The action of the suboccipital muscles is to extend the head and to rotate it toward the same side. Next we'll go round to the front to see the longus muscles and the scalene muscles. Here are the longus muscles, longus cervicis here, merging with longus capitis higher up. Longus capitis arises from the base of the occiput and inserts on the transverse processes of C3, 4, and 5. Longus cervicis arises from the bodies of C1 to 4 and inserts on the bodies of the vertebrae from C5 all the way down to T4. Longus capitis and cervicis are weak flexors of the head and cervical spine. Next we'll add the 3 scalene muscles to the picture. The anterior scalene, middle scalene, and posterior scalene. They arise from the transverse processes of the lower 5 cervical vertebrae. The anterior scalene from the anterior tubercles, the middle and posterior scalene from the posterior tubercles. The anterior and middle scalene muscles insert on the first rib. The posterior scalene inserts on the first and second ribs. The scalene muscles are involved not in movements of the neck, but in elevating the upper ribs in deep inspiration. The scalene muscles have important relationships to the subclavian artery and the brachial plexus, shown in Volume 1 of this atlas. Now we'll add the clavicles and the scapulae to the picture and go round to the back again to look at 3 large muscles that shape the back of the neck: semispinalis, splenius, and trapezius. We'll add semispinalis to the picture first. Here's semispinalis. It arises by many tendons of origin from the articular processes of C4 to C7 and from the transverse processes of T1 to T6. Semispinalis runs almost vertically to insert here on the occiput, just behind the 2 rectus muscles. The action of semispinalis is to extend the head. In addition, when we're upright or leaning forward, the tonic action of semispinalis prevents gravity from flexing the head. Next we'll add splenius to the picture. Here's splenius. It's a broad strap of muscle which arises from the spinous processes of T3 to C7 and from the lower half of the nuchal ligament. Splenius passes upward and laterally to insert in the lateral half of the superior nuchal line and on the back of the mastoid process. Splenius assists in rotating the head toward the same side. This muscle beside splenius is levator scapulae, which is shown in Volume 1 of this atlas. Lastly, we'll add trapezius to the picture. Here's trapezius. Trapezius is a large and complex muscle. As shown in Volume 1, its lower part extends all the way down to T12. Here we're concerned only with its upper part. The upper part of trapezius arises from the medial part of the superior nuchal line and from the nuchal ligament. Its fibers fan out downward and laterally to insert on the spine of the scapula, the acromion, and the lateral third of the clavicle. The trapezius muscles largely define the shape and outline of the neck, both from behind, here are the two trapezius muscles, and from in front. This is trapezius again. Trapezius is thought of mainly as a shoulder muscle. Its upper part raises the scapula. In addition, when the scapula is held steady by the action of other muscles, trapezius acts in the same way as semispinalis, in extending the head and in keeping the head upright when we lean forward. The last muscle to add to our picture is the sternocleidomastoid. Here it is. It arises from here on the mastoid process and just behind it. The sternocleidomastoid muscle runs downwards, forwards, and medially to insert partly on the medial end of the clavicle and partly on the manubrium. Contraction of one sternocleidomastoid muscle produces rotation of the head toward the opposite side. Contraction of both sternocleidomastoids together produces flexion of the head and cervical spine. When we're leaning backwards, their tonic action prevents gravity from extending the head and neck. The tendons of insertion of the two sternocleidomastoid muscles, together with the medial ends of the clavicles, define this hollow in the lower part of the neck. Now we've seen the principal muscles that produce movements of the head and neck. Let's review the muscles that we've seen. Here's rectus capitis minor and major, and obliquus capitis inferior and superior. Here's longus capitis and longus cervicis. Here are the scalene muscles, anterior, middle, and posterior. Here's semispinalis, splenius, and trapezius. And here's the sternocleidomastoid. That brings us to the end of this section on support and movement of the head.